what has piqued my interest just recently, some petitions that have been put out. So I've always been someone that sort of advocated for sensible legislative change in regards to firearms and firearm licensing and whatnot. And I've been in the trade now for almost 15, 16 years. So I'm not talking with any sort of credentials, but I can talk with a little bit of authority in regards to what makes sensible legislation. So like I said, I've had some petitions forward through to me, and I will be discussing. I'm not going to be telling you what the petitions are or referencing them too specifically, because I'm not here to attack anyone in general. I'm here to have a discussion and to raise my point of view. So one of the petitions that I've got here in front of me is a petition to repeal the National Firearms Agreement. So the first line says that the National Firearms Agreement is ineffective. And then it goes on to say that Australians deserve the right to defend their lives, obviously with firearms, that firearms are a life-saving tool proven around the world, and not allowing Australians to use firearms to defend themselves puts them at a disadvantage. They mention here that the reform or repeal of the NFA would have a lot of positive benefits for society and the economy and that sort of stuff, and that they ask that they repeal the National Firearms Agreement. But more to that, they also say that Australian citizens should be able to possess a firearm of any calibre or whatnot without a licence, without any government interference. Excluding handguns and automatic firearms. It's a petition that's been put forward. It's getting a little bit of traction. I've been asked about it a couple of times, and I've spoken to quite a few people about it, and there is a general consensus that this isn't the sort of thing that we should support. But there's some people out there who will be wondering, why shouldn't they support something like this? And I'll just briefly go over my reasons for supporting this. For not supporting. Firstly, the petition that I've got here in front of me is relatively poorly written, but more to that, the point of this petition doesn't seem to fit with what they're asking for. They're asking for the National Firearms Agreement to be repealed, but at the same time, most of it seems to be centred around their right to defend themselves with the firearm. And they're not necessarily connected. So if you repeal the Firearms Agreement, that's not going to change any state legislation. So, and the state legislation is often what prohibits the licensing of a firearm or the possession of a firearm for the purpose of self-defence. So National Firearms Agreement, repealing that would have very little effect. And goes on to talk about the right to have unlicensed firearms to defend themselves. Now there's a lot of dangers associated with having firearms specifically within a society for the purpose of defending yourself. There's a lot of issues associated with that. There's a lot of issues associated with firearm culture, which I'll go through in a sec. The use of lethal force or use of firearms to defend yourself. There's issues there. And then there's also the political support issues. So I'll just briefly go over them. First of all, the Australian Institute of Criminology Trends in Violent Crime report is being spoken about here. And I've read that document, and it doesn't actually prescribe in there anything in regards to data supporting or otherwise the use of the National Firearms Agreement resulting in less firearm homicides in Australia. And I'm not someone that thinks the National Firearm Agreement has had a dramatic effect on firearm homicide in Australia. It was already exceptionally low, and it had been the lowest it had been since 1969 in Australia, when the NFA was brought in. And the trend in firearm homicide has sort of petered out, like it has in a lot of places around the world. And so the actual result of the National Firearms Agreement would have very little effect beyond the standard deviation of the number of firearm homicides every year anyway. So I don't think quoting that is terribly helpful. The main issue that I suppose that I have with allowing firearms for self-defense is that you're changing the culture of firearm ownership. Now, in a lot of countries around the world, you can own firearms for self-defense. A lot of countries you can't own firearms for self-defense. And there's not a little easy way of really correlating that, but what there is an easy way of correlating is national service. So definitely Australia has had national service in the past, hasn't for a long time, and other countries around the world still have national service. Some repealed national service in the early 21st century. And if you look at the figures, in countries that have national service, a lot of them do proportionally have a high homicide rate with firearms. And definitely for countries with a culture of owning firearms for self-defense, they may not necessarily have national service in that country, but definitely some South American countries where firearm ownership is encouraged for self-defense and that sort of stuff, they also have high homicide readings. Whereas if you look at countries that don't have national service, you have the opposite effect. And definitely if you want to look closer to home, the peak in firearm homicide in Australia was 1969, and it's not a coincidence that that correlates with the middle of the Vietnam War, when we had national service in Australia. Now, what is national service and how can that affect firearm culture? Well, definitely if you're if you're in a country that has national service, it is mandatory for you to go into the armed forces, and for you to be taught that firearms are a tool of war, that they are a weapon. But further to that, you're having to serve your country because your country is potentially under threat. And they're very negative things to be teaching people. We shouldn't be encouraging in Australia people to be taught that firearms are a weapon. We shouldn't be taught that you need a firearm to defend yourself. We shouldn't be taught that you need to be fearful. So, and definitely in Australia, we have very low rates of homicide in general, but homicide with firearms is particularly low. If a country has national service, then it has a very different attitude, very different culture towards firearm ownership. If we introduce legislation in Australia that allows that facilitates the use of a firearm as a weapon, and now we're teaching people that yes, you can have a firearm as a weapon, you need to defend yourself. You need to be afraid. I think these are very dangerous things that we don't need to introduce into our culture in Australia. I've got a lot more figures and whatnot on that side of things, and if you want to know more about it, definitely get in contact with me. I know I'm going to cop a lot of flack about these sorts of attitudes, and that's fine. I'm very open to sensible discussion around this if you disagree with me. But that's one of the major issues that I've got with encouraging firearms for personal defence. The other issue I have is training. Now, how do you know that the person that's forcing their way into your house has the intention of hurting you or has a weapon on them or something like that? Because if we're arming people to defend their homes against thieves, well, effectively we're condoning the death penalty for thieves. Because, I mean, let's not be naive about this. Firearms can be used in lethal force. They're very effective at that. Which is why the armed forces still uses firearms all over the world. So if we're arming people to defend themselves, and they will use that, if we grant them that, they will use that to defend themselves, then there's a lot of people that are going to be killed who are thieves. And people are going to say, well, they're thieves. It's not. No, we don't treat our own citizens like that. You know, someone's a thief because they've got a drug addict, they're drug addicted, they've lost their job, they've got no other way in the world. Perhaps they have had bad parenting, perhaps they've had very poor role models in their life or something like that. But I still believe that someone, a petty thief or something like that, is still able to be redeemed. They're still able to you put them through the proper system. You punish them, and that needs to be a part of, and a lot of people are disenfranchised at the moment with our legal system because they don't believe people are getting punished correctly for the crimes that they do. But people need to be punished, but there also needs to be that element of rehabilitation of that person and reintroduction of that person into society. And we can't do that if we're killing the thieves. So definitely I don't think anyone's without a serious amount of training will be able to really denote the difference, especially in their own home, between a thief and someone who's coming to your house to hurt you or hurt your family or something like that. So there's another issue there is if you are granted a license for a firearm to defend yourself, what legal ramifications are going to come of that? Someone's going to get shot and they're not going to have a weapon on them. And so what happens then? You've effectively killed someone or hurt someone that was unarmed. So I think that's opening another can of worms. And then the last point is political support. So definitely politicians love their jobs. Yeah, they love it. I'm not going to argue that it's not a stressful life. I'm not going to argue that some people don't have a measure of statesmanship when they get into this job, but by and large, I think a lot of Australians are a bit fed up with the political system that we've got and the people that it attracts. And those people aren't going to buck the trend. They're going to go with what's popular. They're not going to support petitions like this. They're not going to support repealing the Firearms Act. They're not going to support unlicensed firearms in the community. We're only a couple of years on from Australia, the politicians actually prohibiting the import of a certain lever action shotgun. So we're not that far down the track from there. We are far away from making any sort of leap towards allowing firearms in the community without a license. We are even further away from allowing the possession of firearms for self-defense. So I really think petitions like this, however genuine the person that orchestrated this, how genuine their concerns may be, this sort of thing will never get up. And so it is extremely difficult. It makes it extremely hard for when someone takes a piece of legislation or a petition or makes a submission that is likely to get up. It makes it that much harder when you've got pieces of petitions like this that get knocked back. Every single time something like this gets knocked back, the people who are anti-gun, that's like an extra pin on their shirt. They're puffed up, they feel like they've made a win. Every time we lose something like this from a firearm perspective, we lose that credibility. And so next time it's even harder. So I really don't think this petition is useful at all. I'm not going to sign it, and I'm not going to encourage people to sign this particular petition, but I do encourage the conversation within the firearms community, the firearms industry, in regards to this issue, because it's definitely going to come up again in the next few years. So let me know what your ideas are. I'm not the sort of person that watches the Facebook feed continuously. So if you're going to get into arguments amongst yourselves and whatnot in there, I'm probably not going to refer it very well. I'm probably not going to respond to a lot of people, especially if you've got inflammatory comments or anything like that. If you've got something serious, send me an email and we can discuss it that way, or definitely come into the store or something like that. But thanks very much, guys.